Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hi, Arnie. Good to see you again.
Pleased to have you, Robert. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Nice to see you, Annie. I'm just sitting here enjoying a nice showery afternoon.
Okay. Well, we've got, believe it or not, serious cold for us here in Adelaide. It's down to
Oh,
about
no.
10 degrees.
Wow.
Not minus 10, not minus 50. It's down to 10 degrees. So
That's enough to impress even a Canadian.
yeah, this is our middle of winter, and of course we're about 2 weeks away from winter solstice. So this is about as bleak as it gets. You know, we might dip down another 5 degrees on an extreme day, but this is about it. This is our winter, and yes, the soil is damp. We've had our rain. All the water tanks are full, but on these days the sun comes out, and occasionally the bees will think about coming out. They need about 13 degrees to come out, so they might be out for just a little while in this afternoon in the heat of the day. It might get just above 13, so see what happens. All right, the headlines in Australia today, in my view, really are no headlines, but what they're doing is they're fabricating headlines in regard to Black Lives Matter, the rallies around Australia, and also the fact that politicians are flouting the rules of social distancing. And so it seems as if some are more equal than others. And politicians are, of course, the one of those groups that are more equal. They don't care about what they say the plebs have to do. They'll do whatever they like. And in this case, of course, the demonstrations. Now, in Australia, we've got Indigenous communities. We've got quite a few around the place, and they do at times live in their missions, but generally speaking, they actually integrate within society. And so there's an opportunity for them to work alongside, to live alongside, and to be alongside everyone else in community. There is no segregation. The missions are a place, if you like, of refuge, so that if they're not ready, if they're not prepared, or they're not willing to enter into, then that's entirely up to them. They have the option, and of course the facilities there are ongoing, supported and financed by the taxpayer to ensure that they are adequate. And of course, my experience in seeing situations is that the medical support for them is second to none. They will get priority treatment every single time, and I think that's very important. I don't believe we have a racial problem in Australia. I think it's a fabrication of the media and, of course, the left wing in particular. But at the same time, I don't believe that the right wing, if you like, gets off scot-free, because there is a desire to segregate and form, if you like, into groups that aren't necessarily conducive to assimilation. And so I think we have to concentrate on what is realistic, what is the realistic outcome. So as I said, I don't think black lives are an issue. I think it's a fabricated issue by the media. And the thing is that calling for more government intervention, which is really where I think we should go, is we're asking government to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, on that basis, then taxes have to become more and more and more. And the government, as the, if you like, employer of choice, is there. So I think it's something we have to actually rethink from the ground up, because collectivism, in my view, totalitarianism in the form of government or in the form of industry, is the wrong way to go. The individual needs to actually work from his own point. The environment is the key to it. The environment of opportunity for each individual to find expression in their own life. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, it seems to me that the complaint that is being voiced in the United States today is just an indication of total concentration on one group and a proof of historical ignorance, because practically every population on the planet can complain about having suffered under slavery at some point. And this includes the white population of Europe. I've read a book recently entitled Fatal Shore, and it was about the transportation of convicted criminals from England and Ireland and Scotland to Australia. And I cannot imagine any people who were worse treated than those. The stories are just horrific. So the idea that one group can appropriate all the blame that falls on the rest of the world is insanity and really totally unbalanced. So I can just see that they're using this as a means of inculcating a sense of guilt. It's artificially generated. It's something that no longer applies in society. I mean, if you're going to look at slavery, you can say we're all slaves because we're born and what we have to do is get a job and plug away at it for 40 years. It's hard to imagine that this is the purpose of human life, but that's what's been presented to us. And it's what's been imposed upon us. And it's obviously something that is not natural. It's just the effect of having a corrupted financial system dominating over all the institutions of society. So I'm not very sympathetic to the misbehaving that's been going on in the United States recently and in other countries as well. And you can see, because I mean, you have people walking around in Britain with signs saying, "Don't shoot me." Well, the police in Britain, generally speaking, don't have arms. And the same thing in Ireland. It's some kind of collective madness, which is always being concocted for us. The coronavirus crisis seemed to be fading. I'm not sure it is. I'm suspicious that they're going to keep it going longer because they can always talk about, subsequent waves and all that, but they have to have a crisis. And the coronavirus one dies down and they generate another. Totally media-driven artificial phenomenon.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's I'm looking at that and I'm thinking that yes, the media is complicit. It seems to be producing a narrative, mainstream media, and this to me substantiates our position even further, and that is that we are actually the alternative media. What we are talking about, we're producing another point of view, and you won't hear it in the mainstream media. So I'm just going to touch across here, and then I'll bring up Wallace, and that is this is our main website. And you'll find that we actually produce a weekly journal on target, and we produce weekly broadcasts, and we're now producing a weekly podcast. And if you choose to actually use these resources, they're done by us every single week, and we're doing our darndest to make sure that we answer honestly and we answer with integrity, and we use our sources, the best sources that we can at the time, to substantiate what we're saying. It's not a fabrication. A situation is our reporting is not a fabrication. We're doing our darndest to substantiate it. We are the free press, and that is different from the mainstream media, which essentially is just promoting narrative after narrative after narrative. Your thoughts with Wallace Klinck?
Well, as I look at the matter, I think we're actually providing an alternative, and we are not an alternative to a situation that is being artificially generated in order to create increasing tension, increasing demands, which will enhance the role of government in our lives and centralize power in the process, of course. And that simply cannot work efficiently for society. Society works efficiently when it is free to proceed with initiative and when it's able to do so. But when you get initiative centered in a state apparatus, what you do is you literally freeze the initiative, because initiative cannot proceed in the context of centralized control. The two things are simply incompatible. And so it's essential that people be free to associate freely with each other, consumers and producers, because believe me, consumers and producers are quite adept at generating consumer wealth and services when it's understood what is needed and what is wanted, and when the activity is permitted to take place. But as soon as you get politicians and bureaucrats involved, anyone on the private side who has an initiative is immediately faced with all sorts of roadblocks and stoppages and hindrances. And that just produces gridlock. It produces scarcity. It always has, because you can't compare government taking action to a free people engaging in constructive activity.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that, Wallace. That is so important. And I do note these protests that are there, they actually never go to the root cause of any sort of issue. What is actually causing the anomaly between the quality of life of whether they're blacks, browns, or brindles or whatever? The quality of life for all people. I've got a book in the library, something like They Were White and They Were Slaves. It talks about white slavery, as you say. So it's certainly not unprecedented. The protests are not going to the root cause of the problem. What is actually impoverishing people? What is causing them to not receive what is theirs? Now, you've got to consider the productive capacity of the world is well within the scope to feed and clothe and house everyone. It has the capacity to do it. We've only got to stop for a moment and just place yourself abstractively in a time of war, of wanton destruction, two sides just producing and destroying, and at the same time, the standard of living back home was actually improving. The standard of living was improving during times of war. Now, the advancement since this time of war is absolutely colossal. Robots are doing the work, advanced control, computers, all these sorts of things. We are producing or capable of producing so much. There is no need to have any shortage whatsoever. So you've got to come back and think, well, okay, this perceived need for government intervention. Why is this? Why is it? It's because people are not confident. They are not confident there is actually enough. They're not confident there isn't enough. And yet, as I understand it, the farmers in America are actually ploughing their crops back into the ground because they don't have a market for it. People are going hungry and they're ploughing their crops back into the ground. That's the insanity that's going on. That's why these demonstrations about Black Lives Matter, yes, they do, but everyone's life matters. And if it's insufficiency that they have, then it's a consideration. We've got to go back to the actual root cause of it. Where does it come from? Man is just not an economic unit. He's not meant to just be on a millstone and continue on his whole life. If the machines are doing it, then we've got to actually look harder and find a response. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, exactly, Arnie. There's so many groups who've got justification for grievances, even in Canada. We had Japanese internment in the war, Second World War. We had Ukrainian internment in the First World War. These people were put in camps and stripped of their property, and it was never restored to them. So there are all kinds of people who could be grieving the past, but we shouldn't be looking at the past, because the opportunities of the future, if this financial system would release them to us, are so great. So, look at the North American Indians, particularly in the United States. There was a program of extermination. Are these people going to hold on to that horrible experience for the rest of time and demand compensation? No, there's lots. If we would just come together, recognize the opportunities that the modern economy provides for all, and if we cooperate to develop those, we can do well. But instead, we have a corrupt press, which is concentrated as it has never been before in just a few hands, and it is constantly trying to set people at odds against each other. They're not trying to bring people together in a spirit of cooperation with vision of a prosperous and happy future. They want people at each other's throats, competing for the scraps that the financial system allows us to have, not allowing us to develop the abundance that is potential.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's beautifully put. Beautifully put. That the abundance, the potential abundance that is there, and so we do. We need to rethink the narrative from the ground up. Is the purpose of government there to provide for all? Is its whole function, or is it there to provide an environment so that each can actually pursue a life of their own, a life of, if you like, fulfillment of their own, an environment where they can actually associate freely, speak freely, and take the initiative, as as Wallace has brought on about, to develop, to flower, to all these sorts of things that a free people can do and find expression. It is so important, because if you want government to do everything for you, then of course government will place conditions on that. And the threat nowadays, of course, is this vaccination passport. Mandatory vaccines if you want government support. Otherwise, you shall not. He who shall not work shall not eat. A Puritan attitude coming from our government, Big Brother, 1984. Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Yes, that's true. And believe me, these revolutionary initiatives are being taken for the express purpose. Well, not always express. It's very much, they try to hide it. It is gradual, incremental, and accelerating state control over the lives of the people. And they are power maniacs. They are obsessed with the idea that they can and apparently are ordained to conduct the affairs of man. And I don't see where they get the justification for this. Where is the authorization? They have no authorization to do this. So it's a situation where, you see, we have to understand there has been a problem over ownership. People who had ownership of the means of production were usually wealthier people, and there were people who were able to gain a lot of control over the community by their ability to direct resources, control resources, and in the process control other people. See, Major Douglas took a very different approach to this. He did not see the evil in private ownership. He saw the evil in the obstructions that are placed before productive forces. Marx attributed the world's problems, certainly the working man's, the poorer classes' problems, to the fact that there were wealthy landowners and factory owners and people who were able to control the conditions of their life to a very great extent. And Douglas saw things differently. He saw efficiency in private ownership, because the private owner has a special interest in making his enterprise or his activity successful, efficient, and something that produces things of genuine value, which will attract the market to everyone's benefit. Marx wanted to shut down private ownership, take all productive functions in the hands of the state. Well, we saw what happens last century. We saw very well what happens. And it happened in Germany too, to an extent, although they were much more efficient than the communists, but nevertheless, there was a certain inefficiency in Germany in the National Socialist Administration also, because they also became involved with large corporations and so on. So it wasn't a really genuinely free association. No, not at all. But it was more successful than the communists because the communists were totally collectivist. There was no private ownership. And their inefficiency was very much revealed. So Douglas wanted a system where people were free, but where they were all free economically, where they were able to produce and distribute the results of production in a way that was to everybody's benefit. But in the communist order of things, you were required to work. You were in the fascist system too. They were both tyrannies in that sense. Douglas he put forth measures or suggestions that would have allowed people to exist freely, in free association, I mean, while at the same time producing, and not only producing, but producing much more efficiently than collectivist production, as with the communists and fascists.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Wallace. I actually saw some quotes in one of the social credit books just this morning, and Douglas's words in regard to freedom. The first freedom, of course, is freedom of thought, and that you'll find that freedom of thought is also expressed in speech and association. And the second part of freedom is freedom from encroachment of the bureaucracy. Now you'll find the bureaucracy is continually expanding and encroaching on every part of your life. And the current threat, of course, is vaccination and vaccination passports in order to travel, in order to move about, in order to hold employment, whatever. So this encroachment by the bureaucracy, and it doesn't matter whether it's a fascist, a Nazi, or a communist or socialist regime, it's all the same. The bureaucracy is the domineering factor. And of course, the bureaucrat hides behind the politician. The politician is only the facade of government, whereas in these totalitarian regimes, it's actually the bureaucracy that runs everything. You elect the dictatorship, but the dictatorship doesn't change. And of course, the third facet of freedom, we call it democracy, but I don't believe we actually understand what freedom and democracy is, in the sense if it's a majority vote, then it's obviously the mob rules, but it's not the majority vote. It's actually the free association to actually exercise your political will. So even if it's a minority of one, as long as you can hold some sway of influence over your particular environment and achieve the results that you need. And that's why government should be so limited. That's why Australia's development was a limited constitutional, very specific boundaries of government. And of course, we've seen the erosion of those boundaries. And that's why within these forums, we will continually talk about civics. We will continually talk about our constitution, about limiting the power of government, and also of holding government to account. And it's not just the politicians. We visualize in a sense that okay, we have a vote once every 3 or 4 years. That's what government is. That's what it has evolved to. Not at all. Nothing like it. A free people living in a democracy has some say in its policy. And this is why we've got to actually look further and consider things like the power of veto. Should the community, individuals in community, be able to protest about a law, protest about a particular politician, or protest about a particular bureaucrat or bureaucratic policy? That's why veto is so important, that outside of Parliament, these things, these initiatives should still be able to take place. So what we're promoting, what we're suggesting here is a review, a reconsideration, a reorientation of our thinking. Man is not just an economic unit. He needs to be able to have a security of supply and security of sustenance of food, clothing, and shelter. He needs those things for sure. But once that question is answered, then these things, these spiritual things about freedom, freedom of speech, of thought, of association, of intellect, choosing policy, these are the things that we need to be considering or reconsidering at this time in history. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, the bigger government gets, the more it promotes the idea that it is fundamentally benevolent. Mm. And this is an idea that is relatively new in our society. There were many political philosophers who expressed the view that government was fundamentally dangerous and that it needed to be always limited in some form. But those limitations are now falling by the wayside everywhere. And the result is that we no longer have the sense of the danger inherent in government. At least fewer and fewer people seem to. Also, I hear people expressing delight all the time that they're getting all this largesse from the government with this COVID crisis. It's something that ultimately they're going to have to pay for. Their children are going to have to pay for, unless they change the rules of the financial system, which they certainly are not showing any evident inclination to do. And as this control by government increases, it falls behind a kind of bureaucratic veil, and you never know where the policies are coming from. Every time there's an election, the opposition party says, the government is not transparent. We will introduce fantastic transparency if you elect us. As soon as they're elected, they become as obscure and as controlling as the people they're replacing. It's just a standard feature of a political platform these days. But that if we had transparency, surely we should know the individuals who are coming up with the ideas for the government policies that are being imposed upon us. I look at this COVID thing, and as far as I can see, as Canada is concerned, there were about 3 people who decided that the whole country should be shut down. There was Neil Ferguson, a total hypocrite in Britain, who came up with a dubious study that wasn't even peer-reviewed by other specialists in his area. How can this be that just one guy gets to decide that this is the right policy when it has such dramatic consequences for people? And then there is this Anthony Fauci fellow in the United States. He seems to have all kinds of conflicts of interest because he's got, investment involvement in the vaccine business. In Canada, we have a woman who 10 years ago was saying, if you didn't take a vaccine, you should have to wear a bracelet identifying you as a heretic. And if you persisted in not getting your vaccine, you should be incarcerated. So who are these people? And are they even the source of the policies that are coming through? I think the population has a right to know the derivation of these ideas and the architects of them. But that idea simply doesn't exist in our society. The policies come from God only knows where, and we are just supposed to go along with them. Yeah. We're sinking into a pure dictatorship.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. That's we are experiencing exactly the same in Australia. I think it's called the National Cabinet. I'll actually provide links to it. I know that I've placed the cover, the actual structure. I got an image of the structure and placed it on the front of one of the videos, and they were issuing edicts. They were issuing new proclamations, if you like, every week, and so you didn't. And the thing is that this was while Parliament was shut down. There was no debate. There was no concern. There was no reconsideration. There was no second opinion. And the thing is that this influenced, this launched our economy. This absolutely melted the middle class, the business people who need a cash flow in order to sustain. And of course the ramifications of this will be felt for years to come. the level of indebtedness, the increased indebtedness, the job prospects, the future, the chance of actually working your way through this whole equation for the next generation. And of course, the argument about, if you like, the cultural, now what's it called? The cultural dialectic, the cultural conflict, cultural wars, Marxist cultural conflicts that are going on. These things are
Cultural
deliberate.
Marxism.
Yeah, they're deliberate and they're designed to actually cause this conflict rather than resolution. And you never, as I say, you never go to the root cause. These bureaucrats who come up with this sort of, um, if you like, prophetizing, fortune telling, chicken entrails or tea leaves, it's no better. These bureaucrats, are they held to account? Are the politicians who are so quick to accept their advice and not actually subject to the scrutiny of debate, are they held to account? No, they're not. This is why consideration of things like veto are absolutely vital. If we continue on down this line, yes, we will experience dictatorship as it gets worse and worse. The right to choose or refuse anything will be a privilege bestowed on you by government and only by government. And that's not how the Westminster system originated. It was through blood, sweat and tears of tyranny, resisting tyranny, and we've got to reconsider the direction that we've gone. I believe it's the wrong direction. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Certainly is, Arnie. Thing it is that nature does not, it abhors a vacuum. It does not tolerate a vacuum. If power is moved from one place to another source of power moves in to fill that vacuum. And if the power is not transferred maximally to the population of individuals, then of course it will gravitate toward those who want to move in and fill the positions of power. Now, for instance, there's going to be this Davos conference in Europe again, and this apparently the chief light in this organizing this thing is someone who has had, I think, a fairly significant association with the London School of Economics. Now, the London School of Economics was set up in the early part of the last century, and one of the major funders, the financiers behind it, made it clear that it was being set up to establish the technicians to administer the future socialist world state. Now that means that we are moving more and more to administration by technique, by people who are basically technologists, so they're people who are bureaucrats. And so this means that the power is being centered more in the hands of these bureaucrats and taken away more and more from the hands of the individual people. Well, how are you going to decide what you want to be produced this month or this week or this year will be decided more and more by technocrats. Douglas wrote an article on technocracy. He's very critical of it because it is a form of highly centralized, intensely organized organization by bureaucrats. So we choose to be free in the sense that we can choose our lifestyle and the manner in which we produce and consume, or we don't. And if we give it over to other people, we're going to find that life is not going to be the way we perhaps had it envisaged it, and certainly will not be the way we are going to enjoy it, because they have their ideological notions about how things should be done. And they're, being administrators, they're not at all averse to implementing rules and regulations and legislation to control people. That's what they will do. We got a taste of it during this viral thing just recently. And but believe me, that's just a taste. Bad enough, but it was just a taste of what's going to happen in the future unless we take back control of our lives.
No worries.
And to do that, we have to demand that we receive what is ours due as an inheritance. We've got to get over this notion that certain people produce all wealth. Wealth is produced by people currently, but it's also produced as a consequences of the very, very great developments that have been taken place in the past, and that's passed on to people as an inheritance which belongs to everyone and should be dispersed in place of these big, enormous debts that the state is incurring. We should be using that capacity to create credit to disperse the wealth that's flowing from the productive system to the extent that the costs are coming from overheads, costs that are deriving from the past. Current costs are due to people who are currently producing, taking part in production. And everyone who's doing that should be rewarded according to their percentage of contribution to it. But increasingly, that contribution is getting smaller and smaller relative to the contribution that our overheads are, our inheritance from the past in terms of know-how, technique, the developments that we have managed to achieve over the centuries, but most rapidly in recent times. And the costs, of course, are becoming less due to current labor and more due to these past costs, these overheads. So naturally, income should be dispersed, or distributed proportionately. In other words, the incomes that you get from your work are diminishing, and the reward you get for them should be diminishing, which idea shocks labor. And the income that we get as an inheritance, which is this is created against the costs that we have in the productive system due to the things that are brought forward from the past, but are not part of current costs. So income should be getting greater and greater due to inheritance, and less and less due to work. And that is simply a statement of efficiency, simply stated.
No worries. Thank you for that, Wallace. I know that that's an extended consideration for you folks, and there's plenty of resources. There's absolutely a bucket load of resources on our website in the library. I've made a point of breaking the libraries up into 5 distinct areas now. But before I call for closing comments and thoughts, I want to actually cut across to something because because there was a mention that Davos is going to meet again, and the thing is that these coming together, if you like, of think tanks of political energy, politically, industrially, monetarily, if you like, a concentration of energy in order to pursue policy. We need to consider the basis of what's actually coming from these think tanks. Now, I want to actually illustrate something here and then take into account what we've just experienced in these last few months. This is a website. It's the Scrip Institution of Oceanography, and it's actually a world-renowned oceanography at San Diego in America, and it shows you the concentration of CO2. And I think, isn't that an interesting? You're looking from about 1700 to the year 2020 in the hockey stick, if you like. And I think, okay, that's interesting. That's over 2 years. But what if we we look at that in consideration and we say, okay, the different time frames. So that was over several hundred years. 300 years. So on the basis of these different time frames, I find this interesting. Obviously, it's cyclic, winter to summer, northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere, things like that, the full record. But have a look at this, 800,000 years. 800,000 years, the cycle of CO2. This is through ice cores up till 1958, and from 1958 it's actually been monitoring the CO2. So the level of CO2 in the world, the environment, is not unprecedented. It's something that we actually need to consider in taking into account what's actually going on. I think it really, really is important to look at these things in context. Now, another thing to note is that that particular CO2, let's have a look at it. We've been in shutdown mode on the planet for the last 2 months. We've been in shutdown mode. Now, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? The whole argument for CO2 was that we had to deindustrialize. Now, are you seeing a rapid decline in CO2? You're not actually, are you? You're not seeing anything at all that is so profound that you actually have to reconsider and say, well, of course they were right. I don't think they are. I don't think they are. I think that CO2 trend shows you that it's been cyclic, and it's been cyclic many, many times over. And we need to consider the ramifications of those cycles. It's certainly not unprecedented in the history of the world that CO2 has been higher and lower than what it is today, and it's something that the world does. If we deindustrialize on the basis that the CO2 is actually on the rise, and yet we shut down the whole world for 2 months and there's no appreciable change. This is inductive science. You've got to consider the inputs. This is what you do. You test the inputs against the theory. And if the inputs don't substantiate the theory, then you've got to actually review the theory. So it's to me, this is most important. Davos is going to meet on the basis that they want more power. They want to control the world, control the economy even further, and yet the actual data is not showing you that. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
It's very important for people to understand the thinking of many of the people who are in positions of power today. And they are people who have been raised in an environmental of Marxist thinking. I remember back in the 60s when I was in university, I was studying history, and it was quite a revelation to me to discover that virtually all of my professors were Marxists. I discovered this as a result of private conversations with them. I was getting into a bit of trouble with them, actually. So that was how it became evident to me what was going on. So right now we're inheriting decades and decades of conditioning in the academic world in Marxist thinking. And Marxist thinking is based on dialectics. They want conflict. They don't want harmony. And so we hear conservative politicians today speaking about conservative, or not conservative, but creative destruction. This is pure Marxist dialectics. They want to create by causing problems. Create a problem, find a solution. And they've been doing this forever. I was surprised to hear Michael Hudson, who is a strong critic of the financial system in many respects, but he came from Wall Street, and he said that everybody on Wall Street is a Marxist. Well, it seems as if they're everywhere. I remember when Richard Nixon said, we're all Keynesians now. Well, Keynes, I don't know if he was a strict Marxist, but he was certainly a Fabian socialist. Same kind of basic thinking. So we're helpless, really, unless we understand the kind of reasoning processes that the power elite are using to develop policy for us. And even this phenomenon that we see everywhere, I see it everywhere, it's just, I'm so attuned to it now, I'm so conditioned to look for it, of cognitive dissonance in writing, in films and all this. It's where ideas are set up and they're incompatible, but they're juxtaposed in such a way that you have to sort of reconcile them in your mind. You do this you try to do this subconsciously, but it can't be done because they don't fit together. So your thinking process is paralyzed by this. Everywhere we look in the world, we see this phenomenon of dialectics being encouraged, and dialectics will not allow us to live in harmony and prosperity because there's no conflict in that. And the dialectic thrives on conflict. So it's very important that people become armed with the knowledge that this is the kind of thinking that is creating their world. It's sort of a sad and dramatic note to end on, perhaps, but it's critical for people to understand where these policies are coming from. And they're coming from that dialectical thinking.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's a very well put summary. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Oh, I wasn't where you were going to call on me again. But anyway, I was just going to say that underlying all of this is the idea that man was born to work. And unfortunately, the further extension of that thought, that man was meant to work under someone else's direction. And the technocrats of this world are dead set on making sure that people will continue to work under external direction. In other words, there's no time for leisure. There's no time for rest. We are born to work as literal slaves. They're certainly subservient to other personalities. And we've got to get over that idea. We are born free, and we have to assert our freedom and demand our inheritance, which is not to be taken from anybody else. And that is the only way we are going to become a genuinely free and whole people.
Thank you, Wally. That's beautifully put. I'm going to cut across to our training because Robert's reinforcing learning and understanding. That's not going to come easy. Now, the League has developed, has been writing, has been producing journals for over 100 years. And our archives, which you'll find in the Social Credit Library, are there. Also the PDF library, which is here. That's most important because that's any sort of interesting writer that might have something to say. We've placed them in that PDF library. Video library, a new podcast, which is there with Freedom Potentials, and of course the On Target archives. But this Actionist Corner, recently developed, I think it's most important because in this middle area here, I've actually built the social credit training area. And you could start at the top under social dynamics as the first and work your way through. And what you'll do is you'll find that these training modules or training manuals also are complemented in our video library, or in actual fact in YouTube is a large repository of our video production is in YouTube. We're slowly building up BitChute and Bright Eon, so they're there. But our podcast library, yes, we're building on that as well. So you have all the facilities, you have every opportunity to be able to learn to decipher what is actually going on, to interpret the news for what it is. Propaganda through the mainstream media. Very little of it is actually factual. Most of it, yes, as Robert says, in cognitive dissonance. It actually is meant to cause jarring. It is meant to cause disharmony in your mind. You can't actually process your thoughts clearly. A form of brainwashing. And so you've actually got to deconstruct that and reorientate yourself back to the natural world. Observable, scientifically provable, substantiable. You can't get figs from thistles. You won't get freedom from tyranny. They are antagonistic to each other. So freedom comes at a price. You can't get freedom in a vacuum, as in anarchy. You've actually got to be responsible. And that's why the Douglas social credit proposals, to me, have well been thought through, and they are actually an accumulation of thinking. I really enjoy the writings of Dr. Jeffrey Dobbs. I really do enjoy it. And the responsible vote is a very, very important part of that his library, and also, of course, voters' veto. These are outworkings, if you like. These are developments of thinking of the Douglas Social Credit Proposals, the Policy of Freedom. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for today and for today's forum on the crossroads.
Thank you, Arnie. We look forward to the next session.